Welcome to the Audiation in the Wild podcast with your hosts, Beau Taillefer and Eric Rasmussen. Season 2, Episode 3, Competence.
Okay, Eric, we're going to continue with our recap of some of the fundamentals of self-determination theory. Last week we covered the autonomy wing. I guess it's not a wing. You have 3 wings here. Last year we covered autonomy. It's now a new year. This week we're going to talk about the competence or mastery section of self-determination theory and why that's important for both psychological well-being and increasing intrinsic motivation. So maybe I'll just start with, I think it's often counterintuitive to people, but people tend to learn better when they hit a certain sweet spot of challenge or difficulty. And that's spoken about in some circles, but from my personal experience from teaching and watching other teachers teach, people are generally not aware of how much success students should be having when they're learning. And I think partially to blame for this is these messages of grit and tackling challenges. And I call it pseudo-discipline, where you're trying to discipline yourself for essentially no reason. But people kind of forget that learning is best unfolded when there's a really high level of mastery on the tasks you're putting forward. And I think you've seen the change in this kind of lens can offer when you're giving tasks to students. So I'd love to hear you talk about that and how your thinking has changed.
Yeah, well, there's 2 sides to this coin. It's like I'm watching the kids be successful learning and having fun while they're doing it, because one of my goals is to not only erase as much cortisol in the body as possible while they're learning, like never try to put them under stress, but make them laugh and joke around. So, and when they're learning and doing that, I'm enjoying myself. So I feel like I'm getting the benefit of them learning, of course. Why else be a teacher? So I'm getting this level of competence of what I'm doing. Like, this really works, like this mood, in addition to being, trying to master the progression and the language and the, and meeting the children's needs as you go. So knowing how each child is participating and learning along with you, through the dialogue in the classroom. I'm not giving them information and they're, reciting it back or anything. We're into, in music, it's a little bit different. You're looking to have them become more competent themselves at, identifying harmonic functions, which is my whole life. Not just identifying, recognizing and being able to use those at a level that would have the children, improvise and create their own music. So learning, chord progressions and whatnot. But so that the 2 sides is like I'm feeling competent as the children are becoming more competent at whatever the subject matter is and how you deliver that.
I think that's a really good point, not just in terms of the student's intrinsic motivation to learn, but the teacher's intrinsic motivation to teach is also affected by how successful you're being in the moment. For me, it blows my mind that we actually have like pretty concrete numbers in terms of if you ask students to do something on their instrument, or it could be other subjects, not just music, this would apply for, you can actually start calculating percentages of errors that they make and start to predict how likely it is they'll be interested in the subject based on the amount of errors they make. And I think that's really, for some people, they don't like that type of thinking. It feels very mechanical. And I'm not suggesting you spend all your time teaching like that. All I'm saying is when you ask students to do tasks, you should have a pretty high success rate, and you should almost be confident that they're going to be able to do it. And I joke with my students, with newer students a lot of the time, that, oh, I'm just going to ask you to do some like easy stuff. And because often when you give them the right level of difficulty, they'll give you this look like, are you serious? I mean, and it runs just so opposed to what's kind of going around in a lot of education circles, like just get thrown in the deep end and struggle and try. And I think there is a place for those tasks where you try something that's ridiculously hard to do. But, and this is something I learned from both Engelman and Paul Harris, but you can reach a state where you're with your students, you're playful, no one's stressed, everyone's having fun, they're achieving success, and then you ask them to do something that's ludicrously difficult and they find it hilarious. Right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying there's never a time for, really testing yourself in some dimension of life and trying to see if you can, surpass what you even thought was possible. But as a general rule of thumb, I think it's a very easy out for a teacher to say, well, I'm just going to challenge my students all the time as an excuse for not having a well-designed curriculum or lesson plan. And when I mean lesson plan, I mean, I have no lesson plan when I walk into my classroom. I'm asking the students what songs they want to learn. I'm inventing most of the stuff on the fly, but in the back of my mind, I'm not trying to push them beyond them getting 80% success, whether it's with doing something symbolically associated or on their instrument or whatever. But the interesting part about doing this with music is that there's always this realm of listening exposure. So you can have someone listen to something that is kind of outside of their even ability to audiate, and that's not necessarily bad for them. So there is this distinction. So we have to remember that. I'm not saying only play music for people that they can immediately audiate or whatever. There's that special case here.
when I'm doing rhythm patterns and I go ba da ba 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 da ba 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 ba, and they get it, and I go ba ba da ba ba da ba ba da ba, and they get it. And then I go ba da ba 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 da ba ba, and I do that, and they look at me and they just laugh because it's ludicrous. They're not going to copy that, and I can't, and they laugh. So or another thing that I'll do is when we just learned resting tone and major and minor, and that's about it. And I said, and I'll say, okay, now we're going to do Dorian, mixed Lydian, Phrygian, Aeolian, Lydian, and all those words, and they've never heard them before. I just throw them out there like, oh, these all have different resting tones, and it just is ludicrous. They're not going to learn all those, I just throw the names out because they get to the sense of like, there's a lot more out there, and
Sure.
They know that by the way I'm teaching them is. They know I'm going to give them exactly what they can handle, but I like throwing it out there because there's more learning to do, I guess. Just to let them know that there's always somewhere west we can go, somewhere more west we can go, but I think it makes for a sense of learning is really cool because the more you do it, the more there is.
I mean, that's my experience.
I tease the children. I just tease them. That's all. That's one of the things I do.
Another way we could look at this is what are the negative effects of not kind of honoring. I'm not even saying you have to follow a specific percentage of correctness. I'm just saying what are the downfalls of not honoring giving the students a high level of success in their learning. And I mean, if you look at this in terms of why would a student get demotivated when they're not experiencing success, and we can put our pop evolutionary biologist hats on and say, well, this is kind of useful because what if you had to do something in nature, a few tens of thousand years ago, and you were literally just beating your head against a wall doing something that you couldn't actually achieve. You need some kind of mechanism in the brain that demotivates you from pursuing a course of action that makes no sense, right? You're not just going to try to saw a tree down with your hand. At some point, you have to have some kind of mechanism in the brain that says like, this isn't possible, but not just conceptually. You need some kind of emotional mechanism in the brain that demotivates you from doing something that isn't possible. at some level. And for me, I mean, that's an interesting thought experiment to put on here, because it kind of explains, when you see teachers asking students to do things repeatedly they can't do, and then the student eventually has this sense like, oh my god, this teacher, like, I don't want to go to this lesson, they're going to keep asking me
You're,
to do stuff I can't do, like, this sucks.
you're causing stress in the student,
Yeah.
and stress is for fighting or fleeing, you know. And if you're practicing, you want to have just the right amount, just a tiny bit, maybe.
Sure. A little bit of stress can actually help learning. I think acetylcholine is released, and that helps with learning. But I mean, constant stress is not. I
No,
don't think
no,
it's
it becomes it becomes normal, and normal is not functioning at a high level. Your normal capacity to learn isn't going to work if you've got if your normal level of stress is up from.
another angle to this. Another issue that comes in when you're talking about. I mean, it's one thing if you're self-learning, you can think about this stuff and try to augment things. But when you're teaching, you have to be aware of your cognitive bias. You understand most likely the things you're teaching, and so it seems subjectively easy to you. And so teachers can get into this habit where they think what they can do is easy for their student to do because for them it feels easy. And
Yeah,
you can start to unnecessarily push people, not in a playful way where like, hey, let's just try this, but you're actually like demanding that they could do something just because it seems easy to you. And there's this blind spot that you can, I think it's called the Dunning.
the Dunning Kruger.
Is that Dunning Kruger?
I I
Or is Dunning Kruger when you're so? I think Dunning Kruger is when you're so ignorant you don't realize how much you don't know. Is that
yeah,
Dunning Kruger?
yeah. That's more.
This
Yeah,
is like a knowledge. I'm sure there's a name for this
I,
cognitive blind spot, or this cognitive bias.
yeah. I don't think it's not Dunning Kruger. It's somewhat related, maybe. The thing about competence or feeling mastery is that I get well. Why would be why would we be doing these podcasts? It's fun for me. Talk to you to like push myself outside of where I'd normally push or talk about these things. And there's a certain level of fun for us to think about, how learning is happening and how we can make learning happen the easiest from all kinds of angles, not just MLT. That's why we delve into these other, contexts to look at learning and teaching and how they can how they're intertwined with music learning theory. Because Gordon was very, very aware of these, but he didn't, just look at this bibliography in the back of,
Oh, sure.
any of his books. You can see how well read he was. It's insane. And putting those together, he didn't necessarily, want to include everything that's going on. It's just that he synthesized this, this new paradigm for how music learning is happening. And then he wanted the teachers to go apply it, understanding more specifically how we can help children become musicians more easily. Because you can always find out what's, if you can't do this, well, what's missing? Well, the earlier learning sequence. So just if you can't do it verbal association in tune, well, you got to do the RR. If you can't do the RR, well, you don't have enough singing vocabulary. Well, if you can't sing yet, well, you need more listening of song. It just rapidly puts you in a place of what, if something's not working, exactly what you should be doing.
Yeah.
In terms of content. And then there's the way you do it, which is, the teaching theory, theory of instruction, and that's why they're so well paired. And then there's also, the psychological, and here we're talking about what are your goals? And a child, 8, 9 years old, are they going to have goals necessarily? But this whole self-determination theory is that I get to decide if I want to practice this much, I'm going to get, to this level of, or this difficulty level of a concerto or something else that you're after, whether you're improvising over giant steps, which really isn't all that difficult if you know your 2 5/1s.
Sure. I mean, and a personal example of me, like when I was learning piano in high school, I was teaching myself piano, and I really liked Chopin, but I knew at a gut level I couldn't just crack open like a difficult Chopin waltz and really learn the whole thing. But I knew I could learn like 16 bars of it, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, like a sense of mastery over the first 16 bars was more valuable than being able to sloppily play through like 5 Chopin pieces, right? I think I used to play the minute waltz in high school, and I couldn't play the whole thing, but I knew a good chunk of it, and I didn't really care because the feeling of being able to do that was so good for my intrinsic motivation. It wasn't necessary for me to learn a whole book of Chopin tunes. I just needed that little sense like, wow, I could do this if I break it down enough and I master it. And yeah, you just get a great boost, and you get this extra boost, when you're not even supposed to be playing that instrument, in terms of like you haven't been taught it properly. It's super fun.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, Chopin's great for that, especially if you got small hands.
And we mentioned this, I think, last time we were talking about self-determination theory, but there's a special relationship between MLT and this competence or mastery wing of self-determination theory, and that's the fact that not that other teachers don't teach audiation that aren't MLT teachers. It's audiation is taught in the wild somehow, but this theory of music learning really has a proper paradigm for how to teach this essential skill that a lot of people don't have a properly well thought out paradigm of. And so essentially, like, why would an MLT student like the music lessons? And it's because they're actually learning to audiate.
Yeah.
And you can see that in students when they can audiate something, their interest level in what they're playing is off the charts compared to if you're just playing it by rote and they can't audiate anything. I mean, I'm not against playing by rote by any means, but you can really see their motivation light up when they understand something that they're playing. That's a very rewarding experience, I think, both for the student and the teacher, and even the parents. The parents are often blown away, like, holy smokes, like this kid is just like coming out of them, and they see that mastery kind of.
Yeah, I get comments from some of my kids' parents all the time. Like, they just shake their head, and they're really good musicians, like from a layman standpoint. They're not teaching it, they're not learning it, but they really enjoy the music that they enjoy, and they get it at some level. It's like, but how do my children know how to describe and identify some of the things that they're listening to? And some of the kids, are really gifted, but some of them are just normal or above average or whatever, and even low, but they can still achieve. And, when they have a little bit of sense of mastery over what they're doing because you're giving them exactly what they can handle, that's gold. And you see the light in the kids' eyes.
You brought up a really good point there that I just want to expand on really quick. If you take someone with low music aptitude and ask them to do something that they can master, they very well will feel a boost in intrinsic motivation. But if you take a student with high aptitude and bang their head against the wall against things that they can't do, just because they have high aptitude doesn't mean their intrinsic motivation will go down, because they're constantly, we have this inherent tendency to not like repeatedly failing at things. So this isn't necessarily like, well, high aptitude kids are just going to have an easier time. They seem like they're having an easier time because a lot of the content is already easier for them. But if you take a high performer and make them fail as much often that we're making a lower performer perform under, they will experience the same dip in intrinsic motivation, which it's very interesting to look at it like that, because it really just at some point it just doesn't matter what your aptitude is, because it's something that, if you're meddling with kids at a young enough age where you can boost their aptitude. I mean, obviously that's a wonderful and beautiful thing, but at some level it's just like, doesn't matter what your aptitude is. You have to adopt the challenge for where you're at.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to. So something came up, and it's like, but there is something about grit but I don't know how to teach it. There's some good language that you can use. It's never, you can't do that. It's, the not yet kind of thing. Give people the, you'll get there. Don't worry. Hang in there. Let's do something easy for right now to return the. I'm just not sure how grit can be taught, the same as understanding the emotional content of music. I don't know how you teach that,
Sure.
through movement or whatever, but eventually you have to have your own feelings about you. You're either copying somebody who's, showing you how they feel about it, and then you've got to internalize that. But we should do an episode on grit and
I agree.
and what's the lead? I'm trying to think of the lady.
Angela Duckworth.
That's one of them. There's another
And
one.
then the lady that wrote Mindset by Carol Dweck.
There
they
it
work
is.
together closely. So
Yeah. So let's do that because we don't want to give that that a bad name. We're going down a hole a little bit, but one of the things that bothers me all the time is when the 2-year-olds put their eggs back in the bag and everybody says, "Good job, yay!" I try to tell them, just say thank you. This is what you expect of them.
yeah,
Just say thank you, not good job, because now anytime they do something, they're expected to be praised for. And I think thank you is much more sincere. Because it's really not a great job that they're putting their eggs in. Now, if they did a pirouette and they dumped it and then they ran away, skipping, and that's being really expressive and way of putting their eggs away. You would compliment that. Obviously, that's really a cute way of doing that.
well, and a funny thing about that is there's a difference between praising someone's competence at what they're doing versus praising the individual for being good because they did it. And
Yeah.
we know that praising the individual is not a good idea in terms of them being interested in what they're doing and their sense of self-efficacy. And that
Yeah.
to bring this back to the competence wing, what we're trying to foster in students is a sense of self-efficacy, that they have the power to learn things. But you can't do this by conceptually trying to convince a kid you're smart. They don't care what you say. They need to see that they're smart which is hilarious. They have to learn
Yes.
by induction that they can learn things. So you can't convince a kid like, oh, you can learn anything and do anything you want. I mean, they might have an emotional high off that for a week or so, but that's not gonna give them true self-efficacy. And that's where you can get into weird things about praise, because when you start praising the individual, it can lead to very odd mental structures. But if you praise the individual for the specific task they did and their competence at that task, then they're like, oh yeah, I can do that. But
Yeah, even if they fail, that's great effort. But you don't go back and say, okay, now we're going to do it, and I really want you to concentrate this time, or no, no, like this, and you play it perfectly, and then they're supposed to play it. You're taking away that freedom that I think is that gives children an easier time in the moment, and also gives them a capacity to learn that's far better than any other one. When you're in a groove, when you're in that special zone where the student and teacher are really just hanging together. And they have a goal and you have a goal. Whether it's, that's what the self-determination, that you get to say how good you can become on something. You don't have to be very good or high aptitude like that to get started. You just need to want to. And that's another thing I don't know how to teach intrinsic motivation. And I think the only thing we can do is model these things, model grit, model, setting a goal and going for it.
Yeah, and I think we should have an episode about grit, because grit is such an interesting topic in relation to all the self-determination theory stuff, because it's one thing if someone autonomously wants to develop grit, but someone that's being forced top down to develop grit may not benefit slash be interested in it. So I think there's authentic
Yeah.
embodiments of grit, and then
All right.
there's you can get off the rails with grit
All
training
right, we'll
pretty
sprinkle
fast.
some more music learning theory episodes in, and look forward to grit in another one coming up.
Yeah, and this is just a diving board. Like, I really encourage other people, people who are interested in these topics, to go read about this and learn about it, because it's another thing that can change your relationship with teaching, more than just learning, more patterns to teach people, and more about the music content. There's other things about teaching that are worth investigating.
Yep, yep. And how we do that is through music learning theory. You decide the content, you become the designer of your own curriculum. There's all kinds of stuff that needs to be taken into account when you're practicing music learning theorist. And I love that we touch on these things as we consider how we're teaching and how we're learning and how our students are learning. It's just a good venture. I'm sitting here in a nice, beautiful, sunny day. My house is warm. And just kind of, the new year has started, and now it's a good time to reflect on the last year and what we've done. And here we go, onward.
Yeah. Well, Happy New Year, everyone. Hope everyone's holidays were great.